Paul's first missionary journey, he traveled primarily with a man by the name of Barnabas. As his second missionary journey begins, Barnabas goes in one direction. Paul goes in a completely different direction. Paul chooses this time a man by the name of Silas. And their stated purpose in Acts chapter 15 is to visit the churches that they had been at during the first journey. Presumably, they want to find out how they're doing. They want to provide encouragement. They want to provide some additional teaching. And we assume, because this is Paul, they would probably want to start more churches, spread the gospel, and bring more people to understand that Jesus truly is the Jewish Messiah. So Paul and Silas started out. They were walking cross country, and they were visiting the different cities that Paul had been to on the first journey. When they finally arrive at a town by the name of Lystra, they encounter a man by the name of Timothy. Now, Timothy is a young man, and it's apparent from the way the Bible talks about Timothy that people around him know that there's something special about Timothy. He has a call on his life, as we would often say, and Paul identified him as someone that he wanted to take with him. So this young man by the name of Timothy joins Paul and Silas. Timothy's mother was a Jew who was a believer. Timothy's father was a Greek, a Gentile. He may have been a worshiper of God, but we're not sure of that. The reason that's important is because since his father was a Gentile, Timothy had not been circumcised. Paul had already taught that circumcision was not a requirement for following Christ. Circumcision was something that the Jews practiced as their sign of their covenant with God, but it was not necessary for salvation. In Timothy's case, they decided that Timothy should be circumcised, not because it was part of salvation, but because much of Paul's early ministry was done in the context of the Jewish synagogue. And they wanted Timothy to be able to freely accompany them without providing any kind of opportunity for argument, without offering any kind of offense to the Jewish people that they would be speaking with. So Timothy, in order to avoid offending the Jews, was circumcised. We know later Paul did the same thing, as in he shepherded another young pastor by the name of Titus. Titus also was not circumcised. But because Titus was not going to be ministering primarily to Jews, where Timothy was circumcised for his ministry's sake, Titus was not. Paul is consistent with his message that circumcision is not necessary for salvation. Well, once Timothy had been circumcised and had healed from that procedure, they began their journey through the rest of the continent, through the rest of the province of Asia. Paul's intent was to preach as he traveled across that part of the world. It's clear in Acts chapter 16 that for some reason, the Holy Spirit kept Paul from preaching. Does not say how he did that, but it was clear Paul understood that the Holy Spirit was preventing him from preaching and preventing him from traveling north, where he had hoped to spread the gospel. So Paul and Silas and Timothy continued to travel until they got across the province of Asia to a town called Troas. Now, Troas was a port city. It was a city where ships from across the empire would come and they would trade, they would take passengers back and forth, and waiting to see what God would have them do, Paul, Silas, and Timothy stopped in the town of Troas. While they were there, Paul had a vision. He had a vision from a man from the province of Macedonia saying, "Come." Paul understood that this vision was sent from God, so he packed up and he and Silas and Timothy traveled across the sea to land in the province of Macedonia. At this point, we know from the way the Bible talks about it that Luke, the man who wrote the book of Acts, now joins them. So now it's Paul, Silas, the young man by the name of Timothy, and Luke, who is a physician and again, the author of the book of Acts. They travel until they get to a town called Neapolis. And it doesn't really tell us much of what happened in Neapolis, but what we do know is Neapolis is the first city on the European continent that Paul has brought the gospel to. So Paul, in his second missionary journey, has now brought the gospel to the continent of Europe. Tells us that there's not really any preaching, or at least it does not record preaching, and they continue on with their travels to the next town.